All right, welcome everyone. This is Nancy Brown, and I just want to do a quick introduction and a couple administrative things before we start tonight's program for Seabrook Island Birders. I'd like to mention that we had 72 people register for the event, or at least links, indicating that there could be about 100 people who wanted to watch this program. So we're really excited. We have people who registered from 10 different states. 80% of the people were from South Carolina, but we have a lot of friends that visit South Carolina and Seabrook Island and keep up with our Zoom program. So welcome to everyone. And then the other thing I want to mention is if you have questions throughout the program or at the end of the program, Matt will be taking questions, but we would love for you to put those in the chat. So normally on your Zoom screen in the lower portion, or it could be in your upper portion, there's a button for chat. And when you bring that up, you can type us messages and we will have those in here so that when it's appropriate for Matt to answer the questions, he can do that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ed Conrad so that he can introduce tonight's guest speaker. Ed? And Ed, you want to come off? Oh,
yep, there we go. Okay, so welcome everyone. Tonight's topic is wing wonders, the phenomena of bird migration. And we're really happy to introduce tonight's speaker, Matt Johnson from South Carolina Audubon, because Matt is a really good friend of Seabrook Island birders. This is Matt's third time with us. Some of you may recall way back in 2019, Matt's fascinating discussion of Prothonotary Warblers. That's Matt's research specialty. And then last April, Matt and his colleague Nolan from South Carolina Audubon really helped us launch these Zoom programs with a great program on nesting. So when we decided we would do migration for this month's topic, well, who are we going to call? We were going to call Matt. And if you've heard Matt before in prior programs, or if you've had a chance to go out in the field and bird with Matt, like I've had the opportunity to do, you know that Matt has a wonderful way of making the world of birding, or maybe said another way, the bird's world, really, really come alive. I'm sure you read Matt's bio. It's very impressive. He's the center director at the Audubon Center Sanctuary at Francis Beidler Forest, an incredible cypress tupelo swamp forest, if you haven't been there, as Jolene had said, and home a critical habitat to over 180 bird species. That is a huge job and responsibility. And Matt, I know this is your busiest time of the year for sure. Matt's a native of South Carolina, a graduate of Clemson University, has a BS and master's degree, and 12 years of experience in bird biology and science education. So Matt reminded me as we discussed this program that as he speaks, the birds are literally above our head migrating. So it's a very timely discussion for us. So Matt, welcome to tonight's program.
Thanks, Ed. That's a very nice introduction. And perhaps like we're a little earlier in the evening for them actually being overhead now. Maybe they're getting ready to take off. They're getting that last little siesta in as it starts to get dark. So think about that for a second. If you're not familiar with bird migration, I'm saying that it's getting dark and the birds are about to start migrating. So think about that concept for just a second of while you sleep, that's when a lot of our birds are on the move. And I'll show you some maps. So we'll talk quite a bit about that. And honestly, this is skimming the surface of migration. I'm not a migration expert. And so this is, this is probably going to launch more questions than I can answer tonight. So I'm going to try to do my best to just try to wrap our minds around what exactly migration is and why birds are doing it, how they're doing it, and what are the common types of migrations that we tend to see in our area, especially this time of the year, which really is just sort of mid-peak migration. So, and then I'll finish with a little bit about how we study migration, at least here at Audubon, how we're studying it and how others are studying it as well. So I am going to share my screen and we'll launch in. I will say a couple of things. One, here we go. Everybody's seeing that. Somebody give me a nod. Ed, you want to give me a nod? Are you seeing my screen? Okay, thank you. So just stop me y'all midway through if anything cuts out or if you need me to go back or any very pressing questions, then yes, we'll definitely answer them at the end. You may be, if you got me on the video, you may see me looking back and forth. I've got my notes here next to me, so I'll be clicking and looking around. I will say that I have a lot of bird photos in this program, and I have tried to not have them so that they immediately pop up on the screen. So if you want to quiz yourself as we go along, I'll have a slide and with a bird photo on it, and then I'll have, I'll click and the bird's name will pop up. So you're sitting at home by yourself or with someone else, you can quiz yourself on which bird it is. A lot of great photos in here. All of my credits I'll mention at the end. And as I said, just sort of skimming the surface here. So I thought this bird on the screen would be a good one to start with. It was one that we had that a lot of birders got to see in South Carolina this year, especially up at the Santee National Wildlife Refuge, where this owl, you probably notice that it's an owl, put on quite a show for a lot of different birders. This is the short-eared owl. It's one of the most widely distributed owls in the world, occurring on almost every continent. But here in South Carolina, at least, it's not one that we get to see every winter, and it's only seen in the winters. So this winter was particularly good year for short-eared owls. And a lot of us got to go out and watch their almost bat-like flight as they take off before sunset and hunt over agricultural fields. So that lookout at the bluff unit was particularly good for this really cool bird. But these birds have migrated on, and we have other birds migrating in and through, and that's really the subject of tonight. This graphic, it may be a little choppy, but I think you'll get the idea. And if you've seen me present before, you've probably seen this graphic, but I love showing it because it really starts to start to tell the story of bird migration. This map was produced by people like you and me, reporting the birds that we've seen, and it represents over 100 different species on their annual journeys across the hemisphere. It's going to cycle through. You'll notice the colors will change with the time of year. So from blue to green to red as we go throughout the year. And just watch this. This will play through a few times. And this represents different groups of birds, from songbirds to shorebirds, seabirds, a variety of different ones. But watch how they funnel, in the fall, crossing the Gulf, crossing the Caribbean, down into Central and South America. And then as the year turns over, we start to see them make that return journey, funneling back across the Gulf. We think about migration as just being a spring or fall thing. But if you look at this map, it's occurring throughout the year. We have peaks in the spring and fall, but really bird migration is a constant thing that's happening. Birds are moving all around us. And what's amazing to me, and what makes the job hard, is that birds transcend all the political boundaries that we've put in place. They transcend states and countries and even hemispheres while they make these annual journeys. And as a conservation organization like Audubon, we have to work with partners all across the full range of these birds. Even if they may spend the entire summer in South Carolina, they spend the entire winter somewhere else. They migrate through different places. It takes a lot of work to conserve a lot of the birds that are represented on this map. But again, this is put together by people like you and me, reporting the birds that we see. So at the end, you'll hear me talk a little bit about community science or citizen science. And I think this map does a great job of demonstrating how us all reporting the birds that we're seeing can really inform what we know about bird migration and where birds are moving. So let's kind of launch into it. Let's start very basic. What is migration? How are we defining it? Pretty simple: seasonal movement of organisms over a geographic area. As you all know, birds are not the only organisms that migrate. We see it in mammals, we see it in fish, we see it in insects. Lots of folks know about monarch migration, which is even more unfathomable than in birds, migrating hundreds if not thousands of miles and weighing, an ounce or whatever monarchs weigh. But it seems like it's most pronounced in bird migration. And so to me, there's some questions that we might want to answer. One is like, why? Why go? Why not just stay in the same place year round? Migration for a lot of organisms, not just birds, is the most dangerous time in their life. And a lot of mortality happens during migration. So why not just stay? And so we'll get to that. When are they moving? You saw that map sort of help illustrate that, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. How are they making these trips? And then who exactly are we talking about when we talk about bird migration? Sorry, clicking through here. So as I said, unlike any really other group of organisms, bird migration is perhaps most pronounced. I mean, we see it from small birds to large. We see it from short distances to, well, I won't tell you the records, but we're going to talk a little bit about these extreme migration champions. And we're talking about literally billions of organisms when we think about birds migrating. And again, I'll show you some numbers to back that up in just a little bit, but I think perhaps, it's no greater pronounced in any other organism than we see in the bird world when so many birds make these annual journeys. And it's almost, to me, unfathomable to think about some of the journeys that these birds are making. So when we think about how birds accomplish this, I think, sort of across a couple of questions. One, how do birds know when to leave? When do they decide to take off? When do they decide to depart where they are and go somewhere else? When they made that decision, how do they know which direction to go? How are they orienting themselves? And then how do they know how to get there? How do they know when they're there, right? Lots of interesting questions when you think about sort of the why are they doing this? And then how are they doing this? So let's start with the why. And I'm guessing that perhaps many of you could answer this question. And this is actually a bird just returning to our area. One of the flycatchers that we have in the United States, and especially in the eastern United States. And this flycatcher is slipping up a grasshopper that it just caught. Love this photo, such a cool photo. And this is the eastern kingbird. Many of you probably know this bird. And I think this insect demonstrates why a lot of our birds migrate. A lot of them do it. Some of them do it because of changes in temperature, definitely, but a lot of them are doing it to take advantage of food resources. So when I think about songbirds in the eastern United States, when I think about migration, I was out at Beidler today with a group. We were walking on the boardwalk. There were mayflies flying in front of us. We were swatting them out of our faces. There were caterpillars all over the boardwalk. And I'm like, this demonstrates why these birds are showing up and timing their migration to be here at this time of year. They're taking advantage of food resources that are here during the spring when they want to nest and when they want to have a lot of food available. As it gets cold, not as much food is available. They're moving somewhere else. It's more complicated than that. It probably has a lot to do with like past climatic history, where different ice ages and where glaciers occurred and how migration evolved. That's a really complicated question. That's like a whole presentation's worth that I probably couldn't give. But the idea is that birds are really moving based on mostly on food resources, also having to do with things like changes in temperature. And I mentioned the eastern kingbird here, one of our summer breeding birds in the eastern United States. They occur really across the eastern United States and into eastern Canada. And these birds are going pretty far south. They're going down into the western Amazon, where they spend most of their winter down in South America. So when do you migrate? When is that decision made to take off? What is it that causes birds to move? We talked about differences in food resources, changes in temperature, but a lot of birds orient based on what we would call photo period. They're in tune with day length. As days get longer and shorter, they have this sort of internal urge, this internal, whatever it is, GPS that says, hey, it's time to take off and it's time to move. And I always like to mention this when we think about hummingbirds. I get this question all the time of, if I leave my hummingbird feeder up in the fall, will the hummingbirds not migrate? And the answer is no, unless they were never planning to migrate in the first place. We do see hummingbirds that stay in, especially in coastal South Carolina throughout the year, but a lot of those birds were never going to leave. The ones that aren't staying because we put out a bird feeder. They're leaving because of that internal urge that tells them that it's time to go. And so these black-throated blue warblers that Carl was talking about that they're seeing up in the mountains in North Carolina, they were down in Central and South America and the Caribbean not that long ago, and something within them said, hey, it's time to take off. It's time to migrate north. It's time to migrate up into Pisgah National Forest, where they may nest, or places further north than that. So it's a genetic programming that I still think that we're sort of trying to understand. And we do think about it happening primarily around the spring and fall equinox. As days are getting longer, these food resources are becoming available. And that's when a lot of these birds are taking off. But I mentioned it earlier at the outset of the program, there's a different wind to consider. There's not just like wind based on the time of year, but there's wind based on day versus night. So very beautiful male black-throated blue warbler. So I have some slides to here, but I have a link I want to show, and I think I'll show that versus showing this slide because it's a little more pronounced. So let me get out of my PowerPoint for just a second. So some of y'all may be familiar with Birdcast. Cornell Lab of Ornithology puts this on, and it's meant to predict bird migration. If you're not familiar with it, check it out. I think it's a really awesome resource. It's birdcast.org or something like that. But if you Google Birdcast, you'll find it. And every night in the spring and fall, they predict bird migration. And so I'm going to show you two different things here. This was their prediction for last night. And this was the graph that they created. Actually, I take that back. Let me reframe for a second. This was the actual live migration map based on last night. And so what you'll see happen is I'm going to hit play. It's going to move through. You'll see a line go across the screen. That's sunset or maybe dusk. And look how things change. And the direction and the color change, well, the arrows will indicate direction. The color change will indicate the level of migration from sort of the blue and purple being very relatively low to orange to yellow being relatively high. So let me play this through. The southeastern United States was really big for bird migration last night. And look at the directions. Winds last night were out of the northwest, pushing a lot of birds sort of towards the Atlantic coast. And you see it start to fuddle off, and that must be sunrise. So I'm gonna play that through one more time. Couple things to notice here. One, look, you see some migration happening before sunset. So some birds are already taken off. And you see it just all of a sudden ramp up just as it gets dark, and a lot of heavy migration coming to South Carolina through South Carolina. Now, let me show you something different. So what I usually check at night, I like Birdcast. I use it all the time. What I like to check at night is a different site that shows a high definition weather radar. I thought this was pretty cool. If you look at this, and then let me play this through. So this shows the eastern the continental United States. And I can show this link if anybody's interested. And I looped this on for 10 hours, starting right before sunset. First off, you can already see, you'll see the colors change. And as we get into blue and even green, that's showing sort of the level of migration. Really what we're seeing down here could be a little bit of storms, but also could be some migration already starting. So you're going to see this play through and notice as the colors start to change, that's when sunset is happening. Watch along the Gulf Coast and watch this direction start to form as these birds get pushed east by these northwest winds that we know were all pretty strong last night. So a lot of migration last night along the Gulf Coast, a lot of migration in northern Florida. And really, you can even see, if you're looking here bottom right, these birds sort of being pushed. What's crazy to me about this is that this is actually not, this is weather radar, like Doppler radar. This is actually not picking up the birds. It's picking up the moisture in the birds, which is pretty amazing. So Birdcast uses weather radar, a lot of other resources to put together these maps. So if you're curious, hey, is tonight going to be a good night for migration? Is tomorrow night? It can help inform. Doesn't mean that if you go out the next morning that all of a sudden you're going to see thousands of birds or you're going to see none, but it gives you a good idea of what nights are a lot of birds moving. And so I thought, just for instance here, let me show you the prediction at Birdcast for, what is this, Friday night. And again, the darker color, so a lot of these birds are going to be in the Texas area, and what you see there in gray is rain. So we have this weather system moving through, and following this weather system, a lot of these birds are going to be on the move. Birdcast estimates 154 million birds will be moving on Friday night. I've seen numbers based on the highest concentrations in the fall from checking Birdcast last fall of like 500 million. So 500 million birds are migrating across the United States on nights with lots of heavy migration. Just think about that. You're laying in bed, you're sleeping, you know, there could be thousands of birds passing over your head, but we think about this collectively, we're talking about numbers in the tens or hundreds of millions. Just amazing. So why migrate at night? right? Why not just migrate all during the day? If you thought about that, you could probably come up with the answers. There's less predators potentially, especially for smaller birds. When they migrate at night, there's more consistent wind patterns, not as much inclement bad weather. And so a lot of birds have evolved to migrate at night. Also, perhaps they're taking advantage of celestial cues. They're using stars. They're using landmarks, perhaps, that they're picking up at night. There's a lot of reasons we think that they migrate at night. I think a lot of it has to do with consistent weather and less predators. But not all birds migrate at night. Some birds do migrate during the day. Raptors are well known for being diurnal. So we think about migration. You have nocturnal migration, diurnal migration, diurnal being during the day. A lot of our raptors, some of y'all may recognize this one, is the great fooler. If you're ever at a raptor at a fall or like a hawk watch station, because these birds are so confusing. This is a northern harrier. When you see this bird overhead, it's confusing. When you see it swooping low over a marsh, a little easier to identify. Raptors are well-known diurnal migrators. Things like waterfowl tend to migrate during the day. Also, things like aerial insectivores, swallows, purple martins, chimney swifts, they're migrating mostly during the day, and actually they're eating as they migrate. So they've got it good. They're just kind of cruising along, munching on some, insects as they're traveling along where they are going. So we talked about sort of the why and the when, and the question is, which direction? Where do you go? And that's a really interesting question, and probably the one that we understand the least. This idea of orienting, how do birds orient it? And the best, really the best answer that I can figure out, and if somebody knows better than I do, please jump on and say, they have this internal compass that says go this way. And that internal compass works pretty well. Birds can have amazing sight fidelity. So that's the idea that they're returning to the same places year after year. Anybody ever have your hummingbird I have a hummingbird feeder that you put out, and in the spring, you forget to put it out perhaps, and all of a sudden you look out your window and there's a hummingbird at that exact spot where you normally hang your hummingbird feeder, but your hummingbird feeder is not there. Those birds knew where that flower was. They knew, well, they thought it was a flower. They thought it was the best flower ever because it always had this constant stream of nectar. But birds have an amazing ability to navigate. And honestly, we still are trying to figure that out. It's thought that this internal compass could be tied to the Earth's magnetic field. Or, maybe they're using celestial cues, but really it's an internal compass that says go this way. However, that internal compass doesn't always work right. So I think hummingbirds are a great example. In the Eastern United States, we see ruby-throated hummingbirds. They've just started showing up really over the last 3 weeks. And for those of you that are putting out feeders or out birding, you're probably seeing and hearing hummingbirds. However, in the winter months, we have this interesting phenomenon that seems to happen in South Carolina where hummingbirds show up when all hummingbirds should be leaving, and we see them in the Eastern United States. So things like this was a very bad photograph of a bird that I saw, and some of y'all know Jen Tyrell, who works with Audubon South Carolina. She feeds birds in her yard on James Island. This was a black-chinned hummingbird that showed up at her feeder and spent the entire winter there now, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But every year in South Carolina, especially in the winter, we see hummingbirds show up from the west. Why are those birds showing up here? What is it about it? Chances are their internal compass is not pointing in the right direction. So things like rufous hummingbirds, black-chinned hummingbirds, which might migrate south into Mexico and Central America, instead of their internal compass saying south, it says go east or southeast. And we're seeing them show up in the Eastern United States. Now, the question is, how are they able to survive here for the entire winter? That's a difficult question. Probably has something to do with the changing climate. Our winters tend to be warmer. Hummingbirds can make a go of it, and they're probably being supplemented by our bird feeders. People that are increasingly leaving their bird feeders out in the winter, especially their hummingbird feeders, and finding wintering hummingbirds showing up. And we see the same thing with ruby-throated hummingbirds staying for a lot of the winter. So the idea of this internal compass that is right most of the time, but not always. And we see a lot of birds that are vagrants that show up in the Eastern United States, maybe because their internal compass is off, or maybe just because weather blew them off of their line and they showed up in our area. Okay, so that gets us through sort of the why, the when, the how, and then we get to sort of the like who. Who are we talking about when we're talking about a lot of these birds that are migrating? And the way that I try to wrap my mind around this is thinking about how far they go and when they're here. So let's talk about some of the extremes of migration. On the one end of the spectrum, you have birds that are almost completely sedentary. They're really never moving out of their little patch of life wherever they're occurring. Northern cardinals, which you all may recognize, this bird, they often are born in a backyard and they generally are not leaving that area unless something unforeseen happens that causes them to evacuate that area. But studies have shown that cardinals, born in our backyards tend to live most of their lives in that same general area. They're not migrating that much at all. Barred owls are another good example of that. They're pretty sedentary, not very migratory at all. So you do have this extreme of birds that tend to not move. Carolina wrens are probably another good example. A lot of the wrens that we see in our area in the summer months are the same wrens we're seeing in our area in the winter months. And of course, right now, I'm sure many of you are seeing Carolina wrens building nests in your garages, in your front door wreaths, generally in places that you'd rather they not be as they are starting that nesting season. So here's the other end of the spectrum. Does anybody recognize this bird? This bird has the record for the longest nonstop migration. They nest in Alaska, and in July and August, they take off from Alaska and they fly for 10 or 11 days straight without stopping. And they end up in New Zealand, Alaska to New Zealand. This is the bar-tailed godwit, and it's got the record for the longest nonstop migration. I cannot wrap my mind around this. These birds will take off from Alaska. They'll have a strong north wind pushing them. They'll migrate across the ocean without stopping for, I think the record, let me look up, it says 7,500 miles in 11 days. So probably the longest nonstop migration of any bird in the world. That's the equivalent of flying a quarter of a way around the world, circumnavigating Earth, a quarter of the way around Earth. And they do that in about 10 days. That's almost unfathomable. They add an amazing amount of fat before they leave, and they burn through that. And if they burn through all of that, they start digesting their internal organs before they get to where they spend the winter. That's just an insane thing that I really can't even fathom. But it's some increasing technology and bird data that's allowing us this map that you see here that is from the USGS and the Royal Society shows some of these different bar-tailed godwits and the routes that they take. So we're really just still uncovering sort of some of these really amazing, crazy long distance journeys that a lot of birds are taking. Another one that I know Ed mentioned in the article preceding this talk is one of our terns. This is the Arctic tern, one we see only ever so often in South Carolina. Really not that often, every now and then in North Carolina. But Arctic terns have the records for the longest annual migration. So this is a bird that nests down in Antarctica and throughout the year will travel from its nesting grounds up the Atlantic coast into north of the Arctic Circle. They'll circle down across Greenland, coming down the coast of Europe and off the coast of Africa before returning to Antarctica. I think the record is about 58,000 miles in a year. So imagine that's like twice circumnavigating Earth within a year. Now, of course, these birds are landing on water to rest. They're not doing all of that on the wing, but we know a lot of these seabirds are traveling crazy distances on the wing. Things like magnificent frigate birds, which can actually sleep in flight as they are migrating, can shut like half of their brain down as they're migrating. So, those pelagic birds, those seabirds, especially some of the ones that we don't see very often and are so poorly understood, actually have some of the craziest journeys. So just a quick math on this, I think the longevity record for Arctic terns are about 25 years. So if you did 50,000 miles in 25 years, That's about 1.5 thousand miles in its lifetime, which I think is the equivalent of flying to the moon and back, and then back to the moon. Yeah. Okay, so let's think about this. Let's think about it this way. So we have these birds. We have birds that don't ever leave. So you're seeing cardinals right now. There's probably mostly the same cardinals you've been seeing in the winter. We have these birds that are making these insane journeys. In our area, probably a little bit easier way to wrap your mind around it is that you have birds that are summer residents. They show up in the summer months. They nest here. You could also call them breeding residents. And they're here for the breeding season. And they migrate out of our area after the breeding season is over. So we're talking about warblers and a lot of our songbirds. We see this with some of our coastal birds as well. This is a bird that I know Ed mentioned and I mentioned in again in the pre-talk blurb. And this is a bird I've just started seeing out at Beidler. They are really associated with grassland habitat. Some of y'all may recognize this as the blue grosbeak, a bird that spends its winters down in Central America and the Caribbean, migrates back into our area and really across the eastern United States in the summer months. They're just showing up and singing that really pretty warbling, gurgly song, visiting our bird feeders. They do visit bird feeders. They eat a lot of millet, they eat sunflower seeds, and are just starting to get nesting. And so we think about other birds, indigo buntings and yellow-billed cuckoos, a lot of our great-crested flycatchers. There's more really that I could name when we think about these summer residents. Again, we could do a whole program just talking about them, but I think about them. We think about migration as these are the birds that show up here to nest, and they're not here for the rest of that year. So showing up in March and April, they're departing in July, August, maybe into September. Another good example is a bird I've just started hearing doing their little picky chuck call in the woods around Beidler. It's the other red bird. I have to remind people that know cardinals and call cardinals red birds. In the summer months, there are two all red birds. Some of y'all may recognize this one. This is the summer tanager, another great example of a summer resident or a breeding resident. Contrasting with that, we have our winter residents. We have the birds that come here for the winter months and are not here during the nesting season. Right now, these birds have already taken off or are still in the process of taking off. That internal compass is starting to fire up, but they're also taking advantage of some food resources that have become available here. So I think this is a great example. Cedar waxwing. I think many of y'all may recognize this one. Notorious bird for coming in and taking out all of your holly berries or all of your cedar cones or other fruiting plants in one fell swoop. I was out birding yesterday morning and had a flock of cedar waxwings working through a mulberry tree, just going in and out, taking advantage of those very ripe mulberries. These are birds that are about to take off, do not nest in South Carolina. Maybe there are a handful of records from the upstate, primarily are going up along the Blue Ridge Parkway. That's as close as they probably nest to here. But again, across much of Canada is their nesting range. And so other examples of winter residents, a lot of our waterfowl are only here in the winter. Piping plovers are a great example, a bird that I know that you all see out on Seabrook from time to time. And then a lot of the sparrows. So I'm still seeing and hearing white-throated sparrows, but they'll be taking off soon. Swamp sparrows, all the other fun sparrows that we see, especially in the coastal plain, are another good examples of mostly winter residents. And then sort of to balance those out, we have the birds that are just passing through. For me, as as someone that loves birding, these are the most exciting because you really get a couple weeks in the spring and a couple weeks in the fall to see them. This is one that we see a lot in the fall, and actually have been several reports this spring, and I'm sure one that I and Ed are seeing up at Kennesaw Mountain and places a little bit further inland. This is the really beautiful Cape May warbler with that really pretty yellow and black streaking, that little burnt patch under the eye that we see in the males. So a lot of the warblers, thrushes, some of our shorebirds like semi-palmated sandpipers and several others that are just moving through our area. We get a couple weeks out of the year in the spring and in the fall to see and enjoy them. You never know what's going to show up for these birds that are just passing through. Some of our thrushes are great examples, things like gray-cheeked thrush and Swainson's thrush. But migration comes in a lot of different forms. Some birds are eruptive. Some birds only show up in large numbers in some years and not in others. Some of y'all may remember, I can't remember that year, 2014, 2015, when we had an influx of snowy owls into the United States. As far south as Florida, there were several reports in the Carolinas. And the idea behind that was that it was an abundant nesting year for snowy owls. And you had this massive abundance of fledgling birds, and these birds just dispersed across a really wide area. And so that year we saw lots of snowy owls, but it's not something that we see every year. Now, there's probably a better example of this that you all know from this past winter. All of those winter finches. We saw so many purple finches. We saw so many of this bird, the pine siskin, so many that we had to shut down our bird feeders because there was too many of them and they were getting sick visiting our bird feeders in humongous flocks, but not something that happens every year. Only when either food resources north are limiting and they're pushed south, or in the case of the snowy owl, food resources or nesting was super abundant, and you had this influx of fledgling birds that were pushed south. So before I just jump on to the next thing here, let me also say that it's way more complicated than that, because we have birds that we see in our area in the summer that we also see in our area in the winter, but are they the same individual? I think about chickadees. We have chickadees that visit our bird feeders in June and July. We have chickadees that visit our bird feeders in December and January. Are those the same chickadees? Probably not. You probably have local migrations. Chickadees that nested further north maybe moved to South Carolina. Chickadees that nested in South Carolina maybe moved further south. So you do have this sort of unknown, unless you have some way that you're marking these birds. How do you know if that chickadee or that titmouse that shows up at your feeder at one time of the year is the same one? Sometimes they are, but probably sometimes they aren't. And so that's why that's one of the reasons we study bird migration. And so that's something that Audubon really does a lot of. And we work in a lot of different areas. For anybody that's on the call that maybe isn't as familiar with Audubon's work, we are part of the National Audubon Society. We work in a lot of different areas, from trying to make our forests healthy by promoting bird-friendly forestry, by promoting land management practices, and funding opportunities that benefit habitat for birds. We also work on state and local and federal policy that is friendly for birds. And we also do a lot of climate friendly policy, especially right now around renewable energy. As folks on Seabrook, I think, know, we do a lot with coastal birds, a lot of stewardship around coastal birds, projects associated with protecting habitat, like the Crab Bank project in Charleston Harbor, which we hope to be renourished this year, which we plan to be renourished this year, where we'll have nesting birds there again. We also own and manage a lot of land, which really sets, I think, Audubon South Carolina apart from Audubon and other states. And so I just want to mention this in the event that you're joining tonight's talk, you're interested in doing learning more or doing more work with us. We work in a lot of different areas and are always welcoming of your involvement in whatever way that it is of interest to you. I should also mention that we are a nonprofit. We rely on donations and gifts to make our work happen. So if you feel so inclined, we would love for you to support our work. I mentioned us owning land. I'll gloss over this a little bit. And if you're coming on the field trip, you'll get to see this, but we're really blessed to have two amazing pieces of property: the Beidler Forest Audubon Center, which is over 18,000 acres just outside of Charleston, including 1,800 acres of original growth. So trees like this one in the middle, that's a bald cypress in the neighborhood of 1,000 years old. And then we also have the Silver Bluff Audubon Center. That's in Aiken County. Beautiful piece of property, 3,500 acres, right on the banks of the Savannah River, with a wide variety of different habitats, from open water to mature old growth longleaf pine savanna to open grasslands. So a really interesting place to check out. And at both of these places, we have active research projects where we're looking at birds, particularly migratory birds. And so I thought I'd go through just a little bit about how we actually study these birds, which, isn't super easy. It's involved catching them, and that can go from a very straightforward and easy process to a very involved process. So let's talk a little bit about how we do that and some of the different options that exist. One is the cheapest and the easiest way, and that is simply to ban birds. And banding is a type of bird migration research that we refer to as Mark-Recapture. We are putting a object on a bird, and we are hoping at some point in that bird's life or death that that object that we've put on it is recovered. So in the case of banding, we're putting on a little silver band that's got a number on it, and it's a unique number that belongs to that bird only, and it becomes like the bird's social security number. The only way we're ever going to learn anything else about that bird is if we recapture that bird and we actually record its band number. So when the band is first put on, we record it, it goes into a national database. If that band is ever found again, whether by us, whether by somebody 10,000 miles away, or whether by somebody that maybe found a bird that had died, we can get data if that band is then also uploaded into that database. So the goal is to recapture it, either us individually or somebody else out there in the world. And you're getting data from when you banned it, about its age, where it's occurring, it's, all this sorts of plumage information that you can learn. And then theoretically, you're getting data at the other end when it's recaptured. So the best example of banding efforts that have really allowed us to understand bird migration is in waterfowl. And unfortunately, that's because they are hunted, but hunters have done a great job of turning in bird bands. So waterfowl have been very widely studied and have a really high band recovery rate because so many people hunt them. Something like this bird, which some of y'all might recognize, a very elusive, rare warbler of the southeastern United States. And if you're going on that field trip to the Eddystone Nature Trail, you've got a good chance of hearing and seeing. This is the Swainson's warbler. So a small bird like this, the odds of us recapturing this bird are very low, like less than 1%. But it's very cheap to put out these bands. They cost nothing to us. They do not affect the bird. It's easy to put them on. You can put them on en masse with the idea of maybe you'll recapture a few down the line. So it's an easy and cheap way to study bird migration, but your return rates are relatively low. Interestingly, as an aside, this particular Swainson's warbler was one we banded at Beidler Forest, and this bird you see on the right with the band is actually a bird that we recovered that we did not band. It was banded at Beidler in 2009. We recovered it in 2018. Do a little math on that. That bird was 10 years old. We recaptured it the following year, and it became the longevity record for that species. So the oldest known Swainson's warbler in the world was banded and recaptured at Beidler Forest, and basically means that it had been coming back to nest at Beidler Forest for 10 consecutive years. It's pretty remarkable. It gets a little bit more sophisticated with the work that we do at Beidler around Prothonotary Warblers, which is this beautiful bright yellow bird you see here. You notice this bird has one of those silver bands that has a number on it. It's also got 3 other bands, and those are color bands. And the reason people ask me this all the time, especially photographers that are out at Beidler taking photos, why do you have so many colorful bands on the birds? Kind of gets in the way of the photo. The whole idea here is that we put an arrangement of color bands on the birds so that we can uniquely identify them without having to recapture them. And we do that when we're studying birds that are local to an area. So we color band birds at Beidler, and then we're studying them for the entire nesting season and from one year to the next. So this particular bird, each of these bands is assigned a numeric code. So, and I always call this band A because it's made out of aluminum. So this bird is A1606. If A1606 is seen at Beidler the next day after it's banded, or 10 days later, or 2 years later, we know exactly which bird A1606 is based on the arrangements of those colors. So we can really learn a lot about a local population of birds by doing color banding. So if you come out to Beidler on the field trip on May 11th, I can almost guarantee you'll get to see some Prothonotary warblers. Most likely we'll see some that are banded. With a little bit larger birds, it gets easier. You can put tags on them that you and I can read. I know you all on Seabrook get a lot of experience with this, seeing particularly red knot. So this is a red knot that I photographed down on Hunting Island. You can see a very, and I was not very close to this bird, but a very easy to read leg flag. And there's multiple places that you can turn those leg flags in. You can report the code, report the color of the flag, the code on the flag, and then the researcher that put the flag on that bird gets that data. So the larger the bird, a little bit easier it is. And we see this with geese and other larger birds where you can put a band on it. That's relatively easy for someone to read with binoculars or with a camera or a scope from a distance. So the last thing I'll mention is where it gets really technical, and that's the technology that's evolving, allowing us to study small birds. GPS units do exist, and they allow us to study big birds, and we're really finding out amazing things about some of the larger birds, their migration. Things like swallowtail kites and how they move from South America across the Caribbean into the southeastern United States. Or some of y'all might have seen these amazing things that are showing up with migration of great blue herons, a bird that we thought was relatively non-migratory or short distance migrants. But there's now records showing these birds migrating from like the coast of Florida and the Carolinas up to Maine in a nonstop flight. So Google great blue heron migration. There's some really cool stuff that's happening with GPS tags that are informing our understanding of larger bird migration. At Audubon, South Carolina, we tend to study smaller birds. And when you're studying smaller birds, GPS units aren't small enough. So the devices that you see on these birds are not GPS units. They don't connect with satellites. They don't record data. They do record data. They don't record it in real time that you can monitor remotely. These are little devices called geolocators. And we've worked with them on Prothonotary Warblers, which you see on the right, and another very colorful bird that I think a lot of you know that's just showing up to our area now, the painted bunting. That male painted bunting you see here is perhaps the prettiest bird in the United States with that multicolored plumage. But both of these devices are recording light levels. So they're not connected to a satellite. They're taking daily light level readings. And based on just known variation in light levels between latitude and longitude, they can infer a geographic location. It's not very precise. It's not as precise as a GPS unit would be, but it's really the only technology available to study a really small bird. Here's the catch. That bird, you have to put this device on a bird in 1 year. You have to let it undergo its migration, hope it survives and comes back, and recover the band or the geolocator the following year. So we've been fortunate enough to do that with Prothonotary Warblers and also to do that with painted buntings. The Prothonotary Warbler data I can share with you here just briefly. Painted bunting data is still in publication, so that should be coming out soon. But painted buntings, as some of you may know, but a lot of them go to Cuba. A lot of them go down into South Florida for the winter. And so I can tease it by saying that our data sort of supported that. And one of the things we're most concerned about these birds, in addition to things like habitat loss, is the exotic pet trade. So that data can help inform conservation efforts of painted buntings once we sort of really understand their full migration. So I mentioned we were able to recover some of these devices from Prothonotary Warblers, and that data fortunately has been published. This just gives you a quick snapshot into one of those little individual birds that migrated from South Carolina through Florida, across the Gulf of Mexico into Cuba, across the Caribbean, into Central America, and then across Central America into Colombia, South America. Nonstop one way is 2,500 miles, or not nonstop, but one way, 2,500 miles. Return trip is about 5,000 miles altogether. So a 5,000 mile round trip migration. And these birds come back to the same exact location, not just Beidler Forest, but a lot of them. One of the birds that we had recovered a geolocator from actually nested in the same cavity from 1 year to the next. So these little tiny device allowing us to really for the first time understand the migration and therefore start to piece together the conservation needs of these really, really tiny birds. And just for reference, Prothonotary Warblers weigh 15 grams, so about the amount of 2 quarters. That little device weighs 4/10 of a gram, represents about 4 to 5% of the body weight of that bird, which is about the max that we would go. Oops. There's another type of technology evolving now that some of y'all maybe have heard about or getting involved with, and that's Motus. Motus is Latin for movement. And it is associated with radio towers that are being put up all across the United States. And then we would actually put a tag similar to that geolocator that basically acted as a receiver. And if a bird ever flew close to one of these towers, we would get a ping to the tower. And so we are working right now on creating a network of towers across South Carolina with the idea that they act like a virtual net that we might use to catch a painted bunny or a Prothonotary warbler. But all that is required is that these birds, one, have a tag on them, and two, pass within about 15 miles of one of these towers. So what you see on the right here is my colleague Jen Tyrell and I up at Caesar's Head State Park, putting a Motus tower at the top of Caesar's Head. There are several towers along the coast of South Carolina now. On the left, that tower is out on Deweese Island. There's a tower now at Fort Moultrie National Monument that Jen has worked on putting up, several along the South Carolina coast, and we're working on expanding and having more towers inland. And then what we will do is start to deploy more of the little tracking devices on the birds that will then ping the towers. But there's been some really amazing data that have come from this Motus network. For example, I can give you one little anecdote. I should have put the map on here, but on Deweese Island, a common nighthawk, one of the nightjars, pinged the tower on Deweese Island. And we checked at the data on that bird. And the previous year, that common nighthawk had pinged a tower in Virginia. And then like 5 days later, pinged a tower outside of Panama City, Panama. So that's about 3,500 miles of that common nighthawk flew in 5 days. And again, just using basically radio towers and set to a specific frequency, and then having that same frequency being a little tag that you place on the bird. The cool thing about Motus too is you can use it for things beyond birds. You can use it on bats. It's small enough you could use little tags on insects. So it is an evolving technology that a lot of us are using now. So, and then the last thing I'll say is, sort of why do we need to study these birds and why do we care about the migration, is that a lot of them are declining. And there are easy things we can all do. Any of y'all that know me know I'm a big eBirder. eBird is such a great resource for submitting large scale data. I think I threw this on here earlier this year just because it showed all the sightings of purple martins as of the middle of March. But you see this, how like those migration maps can be put together when you think about this wide scale effort to submit data. So there are a lot of community science efforts that we can get involved in that help us understand birds sort of at a global scale, in addition to groups like Audubon and others doing more very technical research projects. So just want to emphasize the importance of this. And I don't want to end on a downer note, but I guess the point of us, one, talking about migration and getting excited about it, and two, talking about how we're trying to understand it, is that a lot of our migratory birds are doing very poorly. Some of you may have seen the statistics that came out, late last year around bird decline, some 3 billion birds that we've lost since the 1970s based on the Breeding Birds Survey. And, a lot of these birds are migratory birds. There are Prothonotary warblers, and they are summer tanagers, and they are, red knots. And I mean, these are birds that widely occur across South Carolina and move to and through South Carolina, and they face a lot of threats. So, window collisions is a huge one. And so there's a lot of efforts to turn your lights out at night, non-essential, non-safety lights. Birds definitely are oriented to light. And so that sort of lends to the idea that maybe they are using celestial cues. One of the best examples of that is the memorial at the World Trade Center in New York. If anybody has ever seen the story on that, they have these two beams of light that they shoot up in the air to symbolize the two towers. And what they found is that in the fall, thousands of birds just end up circling in those lights, getting disoriented about where to go. And so the New York City Audubon chapter has been working with the World Trade Center Memorial to actually turn those lights off for short periods of time when a certain number of birds start circling in those towers, to allow those birds to continue on before they turn the lights back on. So turning lights out, in a lot of cities, there's really tremendous light pollution, which is scary on a lot of different levels, but in particular for migrating birds, they get disoriented by those lights. And just to kind of paint a picture of how bad it can get, when conditions get just right, birds get attracted to lights in buildings. what you see on the right here are birds that were collected from one building on one night in Texas several years ago. And I mean, good gosh, if you're looking at this closely, I see Blackburnian warblers and indigo buntings and black and white warblers and Kentucky warblers and American redstart. I mean, just it's amazing to think what the simple act of turning out lights when they're not essential can do for, not only things like sea turtles, right? But also to our nocturnal migrating birds. You can also do things to make windows less reflective and therefore reduce mortality in birds. It's estimated that like a billion with a bee birds die every year from running into buildings. And I bet if I polled the audience, everybody probably has an example of a bird that hit their windows and died. And I know this, we put these on the center at Beidler because I came to the center one day a couple years ago and there was a dead wood thrush at the front door. I said, we cannot have that happen ever again. So we've been putting up this tape, which reduces the reflectivity of the window. So what happens is the birds on a very shiny window, they see the reflection of the forest and they think they can fly right through it because they think they're flying through the forest. They hit the windows at full speed and a lot of times succumb to their injuries. So you can actually get bird-friendly glass now that looks just like regular glass, but it has an extra layer of UV light that the birds can see that we can't. Or you can put things like dots or tape or other things like that up on your windows to reduce window collision. So for a lot of people, they have like one window in their house that birds always seem to hit. So what you could do is just treat that window, see if it helps reduce collisions. I mentioned non-native organisms. Cats are perhaps the best example, and especially during the migratory time of year. I saw a picture that was posted this morning from South Padre Island in Texas of a lawn that had like 15 birds just sitting on it. And it was Baltimore Orioles. It was a couple different types of warblers, the summer tanager, and these birds have flown over the Gulf and they were exhausted. They'll be okay. They just need to kind of rest and refuel a little bit. But we do know that there are things that if they were left there would eat them. Probably cats are the best example. Cats are a non-native organism. Unfortunately, we have lots of cats that live in the wild, many of which we let outside. And so there are things you can do. One is just during the migratory time of the year, not letting your cat out at all, or not letting it out like first thing in the morning or right in the evening when these birds are landing or taking off. You can also get really creative. This is my cat on the right. This is a catio. So it's an outdoor patio for your cat. If your cat needs to be outside, but you want to make sure that that cat is not impacting native wildlife, you can build a catio, or you can get really, really crazy and you can leash train your cat. A lot of people are having success leash training cats. Lastly, I'll be remiss if I didn't say, we know that the climate and how the climate is changing is impacting migratory birds. Audubon released a report a couple years ago that showed that about half of our birds are and will be further impacted by climate change over the next 30 years based on changing weather pattern, based on rising sea levels, based on a whole variety of factors. So, doing the simple things I think is now more important than ever, and it's especially true right now, as literally it's getting dark outside my house. So those birds, as I'm ending this talk, are starting to take off. Planting native plants, another great thing that we can do as well. So I'm going to finish there. I like this quote. I think it's always a great one to end with, but so often birds are barometers of environmental change, just like the canary of the coal mine. So we take care of the birds, we take care of a lot of the other problems. And so just before I finish, I mentioned all the photos, so many great photos. A lot of these come from photos that people have submitted to the Audubon Photography Awards. So thank you if that's any of you. Just want to acknowledge the amazing photographers and people that have shared photos with me. And with that, I'll leave you with the ovenbird, another great migratory warbler. My email address is here and our website is here if you are interested in getting in touch with me. And I think I will actually stop sharing my screen for now, and I can put my email in the chat if anybody has any questions.
Hey, Matt. So we do have a couple questions that came in on the chat. The first one from Jolene was, will there be a lot of migration tonight because it's going to be colder and windier?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, you know what? Well, we can look at it real quick. Hold on just a second. So tonight did not look that great. So let me go back to sharing my screen for just a second. Here's Birdcast for tonight. So about 51 million birds moving. It looks like South Texas into Florida. I don't know. There's northwest winds tonight. So I would have thought they would be a lot more active. I don't know because there are some weather systems moving through. But it's something that you can sort of look at and predict, but not always. Sometimes I'm like, oh, the winds look great. A front just came through. Tonight's going to be crazy. And you look at the radar and there's not that many birds moving. Other nights when the wind doesn't, or the weather doesn't look that great, the winds don't look that great, there'll be more heavy migration. So it's not always super easy to predict. I would think there could be a lot of birds moving tonight with the winds the way they are. So it's always worth, going out and checking out. But at least if you're looking at things like Birdcast or weather radar, it's not predicting tonight to be, as crazy, for example, as it was last night.
Great. So then Judy asked, she noticed that the bird migration north have very few across South Carolina, but when they return south, we see quite a few directly through South Carolina. So is there any reason for this?
That's a fantastic question. And it's also interesting because you think about birds like Tennessee warblers, some of our warblers that we see sort of commonly in South Carolina in the fall. We don't really see them in the spring. A lot of birds just tend to, I think, migrate across the Gulf and up the Mississippi River Valley than they do migrate along the Atlantic coast in the spring. And yet a lot more of those birds do migrate along the Atlantic coast in the fall. I think one hypothesis is that a lot of the younger birds that are migrating for the first time don't really know what they're doing, and they hit the coast and they just come down the coast. So if anybody does like songbird, if you're ever out birding for songbirds during migration along the coast of South Carolina, it always seems to be better in the fall than in the spring. And it seems to be based on banding station. Like a lot of y'all know Aaron Given, who bands on Kiowa Island. He bands a ton of young birds in the fall. And so the thought maybe is just that we just see, more birds coming through the east in the fall because you see younger birds. But also I just think for certain species, they tend to migrate further inland in the spring. And we see them migrating closer to the coast or closer to the Atlantic coast, in the fall. But again, oversimplifying what is a very complex thing that even we are still trying to figure out. You are on mute.
Thank you, Matt. Just a reminder, type your questions in the chat if you can. Judy had another question. She wanted to know if you're using mist nets to capture your birds for banding.
Yeah, it depends on the species. That's a great question, Judy. Depends on the species. So for things like Prothonotary Warblers, we're setting up mist nets along the boardwalk, and just sort of catching individual birds. You can use mist nets two different ways, actively or passively. So at Beidler, when we're banding Prothonotary Warblers, we're targeting an individual bird, like we want to catch that bird. And so that's very active. We're not catching any other species, just this one individual. Versus we have another banding project where we put out, 10 mist nets and we just monitor them passively and we band whatever we catch. So mist nets are widely used and there's a couple of different ways we can use them. The other thing I'll mention is that for painted buntings, because painted buntings so widely visit bird feeders, we just use a cage trap. So what we would do is go out to our bird feeders at Beidler, take down the feeder that's normally there and put up another feeder inside of a trap with just small doors where the birds can get in. And then they go in, they think, oh, the feeder's here. Things look a little different, but I see the feeder, I see the food, I'll go in. And then they can't figure out how to get back out. We have a little door that we can open to get them out. So it's a little different with birds that visit feeders. We can use a couple of different techniques. The same thing happens with hummingbirds. But yeah, mist nets are also used, feeder traps. And then if you do any bird banding out on the coast with our sea and shore birds, or especially with the shore birds, they'll even use things like cannon nets that they shoot out over a flock of birds, because if you don't do that, those birds are all there's really no other way to catch them. So a couple different techniques for our work. We primarily use mist nets and feeder traps.
Great. Now, so we have another question. This is from Nancy Helm, and she wants to know, do individual birds communicate with each other in a flock that is migrating?
Good question. I don't know, probably. So we know a few things. One, we know that birds make flight calls at night. And in fact, some people are so smart that they figured out how to identify a bunch of different kind of birds just based on these little chip notes that they make at night. And if you've ever been out at night on a night of heavy migration or in an area, I remember I was on one time out on the Maritime Forest on Sullivan's Island, right at first light. And right as it was getting light, I would just hear peep, 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 peep. All these birds were descending out of the sky, making these little flight calls. And again, some people have gotten so good at them that they can identify the species just based on the call. So that probably is a contact call, and those birds are communicating with each other in some way. It's also probably true that not all, it's not like all the Prothonotary Warblers get together and migrate together. Like there's these mixed flocks of migrating, and they're probably all making little contact calls as they go. How much they're actually communicating, I don't know that we know, or if we know, I don't know the answer to that, but they're certainly vocalizing at night. And that's probably, some sort of communication between them or across species even.
All right, and I have a question.
Yeah.
So I noticed that on Seabrook, we see belted kingfishers in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
But then spring comes and they're not here, but yet they're not far away. So do you think, are they just going inland a little bit to nest, or are they actually long migrants and going up to Maine and, that kind of thing?
Sure. That brings up another question, right? And I think about this a lot too. We see that with a lot of birds. Like we see northern flickers on the coast in the winter. They don't nest here. Eastern phoebes, same. American goldfinches, but all those birds nest in South Carolina. They just don't nest along the coast. So you do see these interesting things. So what I wonder is, is the Eastern phoebe that I see at Beidler, in December, is it going somewhere north to breed, or is it going inland? And I don't know that we know. That's just, that's hard to answer. I know with things like kingfishers, we know that they do migrate. They're, again, is the kingfisher that you see out on Seabrook going way north? Probably not. It's probably not like going to the very edge of its migratory range. It's probably going somewhere in between. But it is an interesting phenomenon where we do have birds that occur in our area or parts of our area for some of the year, but leave that area, but don't seem to go very far. At least their species doesn't go far to nest. The question is that what are those little local populations doing? I don't know that we know the answer to that. It fascinates me though. And I can give you a good example. I run a breeding bird survey route, and I start near Beidler and Holly Hill, and I end up near Orangeburg. I do not hear American goldfinches on my breeding bird survey until like the last 3 stops. And we know they nest like in Columbia and further inland. So why is there like this line that seems like they don't nest, below or east of? And will that change as the climate changes? Has that been changing? I don't know. It's fascinating. I don't know that I know the answer to that question. But it is really interesting how, especially in coastal South Carolina, you do see these birds that occur and nest in South Carolina, and we see them in the winter, but we don't see them in the breeding season. And I'm honestly not sure why. If anybody has any ideas. It could just be the local climate close to the coast. I don't know. It's fascinating though. Thanks for everyone. I see a lot of the nice notes in the chat too. I appreciate everyone. As y'all all know, I could probably talk about this all night. So happy to keep answering questions, but also understand people are dropping off.
Well, Ed or Jolene, do you guys want to wrap it up?
Well, I would like to personally thank Matt. He's done several programs for us, and he always makes us smarter, and you're so interesting and entertaining. I get very excited when I see that you're going to do a program. And I also want to thank Ed and probably Aya too for organizing these programs and putting them together and making them available to us. And Nancy, who does the technical logistics for the program. It's a little more complicated than it looks when you click on a link and you're there and somebody talks. So All these people have done a lot, and but particularly Matt and Audubon South Carolina, you've been such a great resource for us that we really appreciate you taking your time and talking to us tonight.
Absolutely. Happy to do it. And I will say, I just dropped put a link in the chat. If anybody's interested in staying updated on what we're doing or getting more involved, you can click that, check that out. And I'm sure we could send it out afterwards too, if anybody's interested.
And again, go and sign up for the trip to Beidler. It's fantastic. And Matt will lead us and talk about things. And it's very informative there too. So there's only 5 spots left. So everybody rush off and sign up. And I guess that's it, unless anybody has anything else to say. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.